On the evening of November 17, 2024, in the city of La Crosse, Wisconsin, a dramatic and humorous incident unfolded when police were called to address a disturbance outside an apartment complex. A 55-year-old woman, who would later be nicknamed Karen, caused an uproar with loud scolding and racially discriminatory remarks directed at those around her. The situation quickly escalated, and when the police arrived, they found that the woman was not only causing a commotion but was also prepared to resist any intervention by law enforcement. The police were initially dispatched to the scene, expecting to handle what appeared to be a minor, everyday disturbance, perhaps a misunderstanding between neighbors or a small disagreement that would quickly be resolved with a calm intervention. However, upon arrival, they were met with an entirely different reality, one that was far from the peaceful resolution they had expected. What they found was not a simple spat, but a volatile situation, charged with tension and unpredictability. At the center of this unfolding chaos stood Karen, whose behavior quickly revealed that this was not just an emotional outburst, it was a carefully constructed performance, as though she had suddenly found herself on a stage, surrounded by an invisible audience. She wasn't merely upset, she was playing the role of the victim, of the wronged individual, and she seemed fully aware of the spectacle she was creating. Every gesture was deliberate, from the wild flailing of her arms to the exaggerated movements of her body, as though she had practiced them beforehand for maximum dramatic effect. Her actions were not spontaneous, they were calculated, almost theatrical, designed to command attention and evoke a reaction from anyone watching. Her words came in rapid, disjointed bursts, each more frantic than the last, as if the more she shouted, the more she could fuel the chaos that swirled around her. It was not just the words that were jumbled, the very nature of her speech was erratic and nonsensical, contributing to an atmosphere of disarray and confusion. There was no coherent narrative in her outbursts, only a string of disconnected phrases that seemed to escalate in intensity with each passing moment. But the intensity of her words was not born of true frustration or anger, it was a performance, an act of aggression and disruption designed to manipulate the situation and pull others into her drama. The real purpose behind her outbursts became clear as the situation unfolded. It wasn't simply about voicing anger or defending herself, it was about creating a spectacle. Every shout, every exaggerated movement, was a deliberate attempt to draw attention, to elevate a minor inconvenience into something much larger. It was as though Karen was performing for an audience that existed only in her mind, feeding off the chaos and confusion she had stirred. In her mind, the conflict was not a trivial matter, it was an opportunity to be seen, to be heard, to be at the center of a scene. This was no longer just a dispute between neighbors, it had transformed into a carefully orchestrated display of disarray, one that turned an otherwise mundane situation into an overwhelming spectacle of self-dramatization. In the end, the disturbance, which could have been easily resolved with a calm conversation, had grown into something far more complicated. It was no longer about the original issue at hand, it was about Karen's need to create disorder, to amplify a small problem into something much more significant, all for the sake of drawing attention and asserting control. The situation, which could have been forgotten in minutes, was now a tense, lingering spectacle that would stay with those involved long after the scene had ended. The phrase, "This country's gone red," was one of several bewildering and disconnected outbursts that the woman, often dubbed Karen, spat out in the midst of her escalating frustration. At first glance, this particular statement seemed to carry a political undertone, one that could easily be interpreted as a commentary on the state of the nation. In American political discourse, the color red is strongly associated with conservative or right-wing ideologies, especially in the context of electoral maps, where Republican states are marked in red. This symbolic use of the color may have been an intentional reference to the shift in political dynamics that many perceive as the country becoming increasingly aligned with conservative views. However, for anyone listening more intently, the meaning of her words seemed far less clear. In truth, the statement could be seen as just another impulsive, emotional reaction, a random exclamation rooted more in her personal frustration than any coherent political observation. Given the volatile nature of her other remarks, it was hard to determine if she truly grasped the political connotations behind her words or if she was simply parroting something that she felt would amplify the tension of the moment. To an uninvolved observer, it might have sounded like a jarring expression of disillusionment with the country's direction, but the overall disjointedness of her speech painted a picture of someone deeply entangled in their own emotions. Rather than articulating a rational viewpoint, what stood out in this moment was not just the apparent political charge of the phrase but the erratic nature of her ranting. The setting, a tense and confrontational encounter with the police, added to the weight of her words. The context made it seem as though she was trying to align her frustration with a larger political sentiment, using the metaphor of a red country to convey her dissatisfaction with the state of affairs. Yet, in reality, the statement likely spoke more to her own inner turmoil and the chaotic state of her mind at that moment than to any meaningful commentary on the country's political trajectory. However, as the officers engaged with her, it quickly became apparent that her words were not the product of a calculated political statement. Rather, they were more likely a reflection of her confusion about the political landscape. The term red, in this context, seemed to be a muddled, oversimplified expression of frustration rather than a carefully thought-out critique of the nation's political shift. It became clear that Karen's outburst was not grounded in any substantial understanding of political geography or current events. In her mind, red may have symbolized something she felt was wrong with the country, a shorthand for frustration or anger, but it lacked the coherence or relevance needed to convey a meaningful message. The officers, in their professional experience, recognized that her outburst wasn't a reflection of political insight, but rather an indication of her struggle to make sense of a complex political landscape. For those listening, Karen's comment was a curious and misplaced attempt at sounding profound, but it ultimately came off as a confusing and incoherent statement. Rather than offering a clear critique or reflection on the country's direction, it became another piece of the broader puzzle that illustrated her difficulty in processing and articulating her thoughts in a way that would make sense to others. In that moment, Karen wasn't merely ranting, she was desperately trying to elevate her anger, attempting to make it appear as if it held some greater significance. Her words were not rooted in any semblance of logic or fact. Instead, they were fueled by a raw emotional outburst that stemmed from a volatile mix of confusion, frustration, and a profound sense of misplaced entitlement. She seemed to believe that her feelings of indignation and resentment should command attention and validation, regardless of their rationality or the context in which they were being expressed. The officers, on the other hand, remained remarkably composed, likely recognizing that what was unfolding before them was not an actual threat, but rather a dramatic, almost absurd spectacle. Their calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the woman's escalating agitation, revealing their understanding that her behavior was driven by an emotional need to assert dominance or control over the situation rather than a genuine desire to engage in any constructive dialogue. It was clear they saw her not as a danger, but as an individual whose frustrations had clouded her ability to reason or communicate effectively. Instead of reacting with anger or aggression, the officers remained grounded. Possibly viewing the scene with a sense of detached professionalism, knowing that this was more a performance than a serious confrontation. When the police arrived at the scene, they approached with a level of professionalism and calm, a marked contrast to the chaos they were about to engage with. Their first course of action was to ask the woman what had transpired, hoping to understand the situation from her perspective. However, the woman's response revealed an alarming lack of self-awareness, as she wasted no time launching into an unsolicited, vitriolic tirade. This was no ordinary outburst, it was a deeply offensive verbal attack that exposed her disregard for social decorum and empathy. Her defensive tone was immediately apparent as she began with the infamous, yet profoundly telling, phrase, "I'm not racist," but, a phrase that has become synonymous with the prelude to harmful, bigoted comments disguised as a mere opinion. It's a rhetorical device often used to mask the toxicity of what follows, and in this instance, the woman didn't disappoint. What came after this phrase were remarks so overtly racist and insensitive that even the most seasoned law enforcement officers, who are regularly exposed to a wide array of volatile situations, were visibly taken aback. Their professionalism didn't shield them from the discomfort of witnessing such blatant discrimination. What was most striking, however, was not just the content of her words, but her complete inability to recognize the gravity of her actions. Rather than addressing the underlying conflict or showing any sign of introspection, she swiftly attempted to deflect any responsibility. She claimed that the altercation had arisen because the other person involved had hurt feelings, a curious accusation given that it was Karen herself who appeared to be throwing a tantrum of the highest order. Her behavior was escalating rapidly, loud, erratic, and irrational, revealing an alarming disconnect from the reality of the situation. The irony in her words and actions was unmistakable. While she accused the other individual of overreacting and being overly sensitive, it was clear to anyone observing that it was Karen who was emotionally volatile, unable to cope with even the smallest amount of confrontation without spiraling into a cascade of insults, accusations, and self-pity. Her inability to handle the situation in a composed and mature manner only served to highlight her own fragile sense of self, making her tantrum all the more absurd in its intensity. Rather than seeking resolution or offering any remorse, she doubled down on her aggression, fully consumed by her own defensive, self-serving narrative. At this stage, the situation had escalated well beyond anyone's reasonable expectations, quickly spiraling into a chaotic meltdown that seemed to be unfolding in real time. What had begun as a tense interaction was now transforming into a full-blown spectacle, with the woman seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the moment. She stubbornly refused to comply with the officer's simple request for identification, as if her actions had no bearing on the seriousness of the encounter. Instead, in a moment of defiance, she suddenly demanded, "I want my lawyer." Her voice rang out with an air of urgency, as though her bold proclamation of legal rights could somehow erase the damage she had already caused. It was as if she believed that invoking her right to an attorney could instantly nullify the entire confrontation, as if the mere mention of a lawyer could dissolve the tension that had been building steadily. Her tone carried the weight of someone who might have considered themselves well-versed in legal matters, perhaps imagining that by invoking her right to counsel with such fervor, she would regain control of the situation. It was almost as though she thought that by invoking legal jargon so confidently, she would either intimidate the officers or at least compel them to pause, reconsidering their course of action. Yet, the truth was starkly different. Her sudden outburst, far from granting her the leverage she imagined, only highlighted her disconnect from the reality of the situation. The officers, far from being swayed by her forceful but misplaced invocation of legal rights, remained steadfast and unflinching in their approach. They saw through her attempt to deflect responsibility, understanding that no amount of legal theatrics would alter the inevitable course of events. In the end, it was clear that her claim to legal expertise had no power over the reality of her predicament. Her demands for a lawyer did nothing but escalate the tension further, and her misplaced confidence only seemed to deepen the sense of inevitability surrounding the outcome. The officers, resolute in their duty, were unaffected by her outburst, and her attempt to control the narrative only made her position more precarious. Despite all the mounting evidence and her increasingly defiant behavior, the woman stubbornly clung to her misguided conviction that she could talk her way out of any consequences. With a tone laced with incredulity, she nonchalantly asked, "Did I punch anyone?" As if the mere absence of a physical blow could somehow erase the gravity of everything that had transpired. "No, Karen, you didn't punch anyone," was the unspoken response. But in a way, her words were an ironic plea for absolution, an attempt to absolve herself by focusing on one narrow aspect of the situation, as if it were the only factor that mattered. The truth was that she had punched through a much more significant wall, the thick, impenetrable wall of denial that had surrounded her perception of innocence. This wall wasn't made of concrete or stone, but of stubbornness, self-deception, and an unwavering refusal to acknowledge the reality of her actions. Each accusation, every shred of evidence presented against her, was met with a dismissive wave or a defensive outburst. It was as though she believed that if she simply repeated her denials long enough, the truth would somehow disappear. In her mind, the refusal to accept responsibility was a form of defense, a strategy to distance herself from the weight of her behavior. Yet, what she failed to realize was that this denial, rather than shielding her, only highlighted her deeper disconnect from reality. As the situation spiraled out of control, her refusal to face the truth only served to widen the gap between the world she believed she inhabited, where she was innocent and misunderstood, and the harsh reality that surrounded her. The incident wasn't just about the absence of physical violence, it was the accumulation of countless other actions that spoke volumes. It was her barrage of racist slurs, the vitriol in her words, and the complete lack of cooperation with law enforcement. These verbal assaults, coupled with her behavior, painted a far clearer picture of her actions than any physical altercation ever could. Yet, in her mind, none of this seemed to matter, as long as there wasn't a punch thrown. Her denial was her defense, a fragile shield she thought could protect her from accountability. But like all fragile shields, it was bound to crack under pressure. The harder she clung to it, the more transparent it became, revealing a person who was more committed to maintaining a facade of innocence than to confronting the truth of her own behavior. Ultimately, the longer she resisted, the deeper her isolation from reality became, leaving her trapped in a self-imposed bubble of delusion. As the situation unfolded, Karen's reactions became increasingly absurd and erratic, with each outburst amplifying the extent of her misunderstanding and refusal to take responsibility. Her defensive stance was clear as she clung to the belief that she had been unfairly treated, a mindset that many adopt when confronted with the consequences of their own actions. Rather than acknowledging her behavior, she doubled down, accusing the officers of asking stupid questions, as if the mere act of questioning her was an affront to her personal dignity. This defensive tactic allowed her to deflect any responsibility, painting herself as the one wronged rather than the one at fault. Her sense of victimhood reached new heights when she declared, "I'm not giving you my ID because you're targeting me." This remark was not just an expression of frustration, but a glaring misunderstanding of the role of law enforcement in such situations. By equating a lawful request for identification with being personally targeted, she displayed a fundamental lack of understanding about what it means to be questioned by the police. In her mind, any interaction with law enforcement that involved scrutiny or inquiry was an unjust attack on her character. She interpreted standard procedures as a violation of her rights, revealing a deep-seated sense of entitlement and a refusal to engage with the situation in a rational way. The irony of her statement, however, lay in the fact that her refusal to comply only served to escalate the situation further. What could have been a simple interaction, an officer asking for identification, was transformed into a standoff. By resisting and refusing to cooperate, she inadvertently deepened the officer's suspicions, thereby exacerbating the very scenario she seemed to fear. Her repeated accusations of being unfairly targeted were not grounded in reality, but rather in a distorted view of herself as a victim. It became evident that her sense of persecution was a projection, turning the officer's legitimate inquiries into an attack on her, even though she was the one causing the disruption. This reaction, deflecting blame and framing herself as the victim in the face of clear evidence of misconduct, was a classic example of the psychological defense mechanisms many people adopt when confronted with their own missteps. By turning the tables, she hoped to regain control of the narrative, but instead, her actions only highlighted her refusal to accept responsibility for her own behavior. In the end, Karen's resistance and warped sense of entitlement made the situation far more complicated than it needed to be, ultimately reinforcing the officer's position rather than undermining it. After a prolonged series of evasions, defiant outbursts, and a level of drama that could easily fuel an entire season of a reality TV show. The officers, clearly running out of patience, had reached their breaking point. The tense back and forth between them and the woman had dragged on far too long, and the situation had escalated to a point where further negotiations were futile. With a firm, unwavering tone, one of the officers finally delivered the unavoidable ultimatum, "You're under arrest." The gravity of the moment was undeniable. This declaration was the culmination of a chaotic series of events, one that had spiraled far beyond the initial disturbance, and it was now crystal clear that the woman's attempt to control the situation had reached its end. In this moment, the woman, a figure that the narrative seems to suggest aligns with the stereotype of a Karen, entitled, combative, and unwilling to take responsibility for her actions, refused to concede. Despite the mounting evidence that the situation was beyond her control, she continued to cling to her sense of defiance with an almost theatrical zeal. Without so much as a pause, she shot back, "I'm not going to jail," her voice thick with indignation, as if simply voicing her protest could somehow rewrite the laws of reality. It was as though she believed that by denying the arrest with sheer force of will, she could erase the entire situation, transforming it into an insignificant misunderstanding. Her words seemed to carry the hope that they might cause the handcuffs to vanish into thin air, or perhaps, that they would reverse the escalating chain of events that had led them here, but, as anyone who had been watching closely could predict, the cold, unyielding truth remained: the cuffs stayed firmly in place. Her defiance and verbal protest, no matter how forcefully delivered, were powerless against the reality of the law. The situation had crossed a threshold that words alone could not change, and the irony was thick in the air. In that instant, the moment seemed to crystallize into a perfect example of stubbornness colliding with delusion, a blend of absurdity and tragic predictability. She had refused to accept the inevitable, but it was a lost cause. Spoiler alert, her denial of reality, as bold and defiant as it may have been, did nothing to alter the inevitable outcome: she was going to jail. Whether she accepted it or not, the course of events was set in motion, and the narrative of resistance had come to a close. The situation took a turn for the surreal and utterly absurd once the woman was placed into the squad car. Rather than calming down after the initial chaos, she only grew more agitated, her shouting escalating in intensity. Her rage, now unfocused, appeared to be directed not just at the officers who had arrested her, but at an unexpected target: K9 Rock, the police dog. It was almost as if she had fabricated a narrative in her mind, in which the dog, an innocent, highly trained animal, was somehow complicit in the events that had spiraled out of control. This bizarre reaction seemed to indicate that her sense of reality had become completely distorted. Her outburst, however, was far from the end of the spectacle. As if her previous behavior hadn't been dramatic enough, she began violently banging her head against the window of the squad car. It was as though she were desperately trying to provoke further attention, craving the spotlight in a moment when it had already shifted firmly onto her. One could almost sense a theatrical sense of purpose in her actions, as if she were trying to craft a larger narrative around herself, casting herself as the central figure in a drama of her own making. In her mind, it appeared that everyone and everything around her, whether it was the officers, the dog, or even the car itself, was part of a vast conspiracy against her, designed to frustrate and undermine her. What had started as a simple altercation had now spiraled into a deeply bizarre and almost absurd scene. If there were ever an award for the most dramatic arrest, this woman would have emerged as the clear winner, securing the trophy with an absurd flair that only she could deliver. Her behavior no longer felt like mere defiance or resistance to authority; it transcended that, evolving into something more akin to a full-on theatrical performance, one where the lines between reality and drama blurred into the realm of the utterly surreal. The officers, now deeply familiar with the woman's persistent and disruptive behavior, remained unwaveringly calm and professional in the face of her continued defiance. They understood the dynamics of such encounters, and their experience allowed them to maintain control of the situation despite the escalating tension. As they deliberated on the potential for additional charges, their composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the woman's increasingly erratic conduct. Clearly, she was intent on resisting every attempt at de-escalation, throwing racial slurs and inflammatory remarks with unrelenting aggression. Her words were not merely an attempt to argue, they were a deliberate effort to undermine the authority of the officers and derail the process. In her mind, this was a battle for control, and though the situation had long since spiraled beyond her ability to influence, she clung desperately to the hope that her outbursts could somehow tip the balance back in her favor. It was as if the more dire her circumstances became, the more fiercely she fought to assert herself, ignoring the mounting evidence that painted a picture of her guilt. With each insult and each disruptive action, she seemed determined to escalate the situation further, even if it only deepened her own predicament. Her behavior was a final, futile attempt to resist the inevitable outcome, a desperate push to retain a semblance of power in a scenario where she had already lost control. The officers, by contrast, displayed remarkable restraint, their professionalism unwavering as they patiently worked through the procedural steps, unaffected by her increasingly volatile actions. It was clear that, despite her defiant outbursts, the situation was slipping further from her grasp with every passing moment. After a long night marked by escalating tensions and chaos, Karen found herself facing the inevitable consequences of her actions. Charged with misdemeanor disorderly conduct, she was taken into custody, and after 2 tumultuous days in jail, she was released, though not without a hefty $11,000 signature bond hanging over her head. To an outsider, it might seem like the culmination of her misdeeds. But it's easy to imagine that, in her mind, the entire ordeal was simply a misunderstanding that can be corrected with one more outburst. Given her history, it's highly probable that she believes this is just another situation that can be fixed by turning to her go-to solution, social media. In her eyes, this platform serves as the perfect stage for her to spin the narrative in her favor. She's probably convinced that the truth is on her side, eager to shift the blame to others while presenting herself as an innocent victim. Her online rants are likely her version of self-therapy, where she believes she can rewrite the events, twist perceptions, and gather support from those who, for whatever reason, are inclined to believe her side. This wouldn't be the first time she's used the internet to air her grievances, and it certainly won't be the last. It's almost a certainty that, in her next post, she'll double down on her accusations and personal justifications, perhaps even pulling other individuals into her web of drama to further her cause. And yet, as she prepares to launch into her next round of online tirades, one can only hope that this time, she'll spare K9 Rock the indignity of being dragged into her theatrics. The poor police dog has already had more than enough of her antics. His only role was to serve as a loyal partner in the line of duty, not to be part of the spectacle. Any further involvement with her would only add more fuel to an already raging fire, deepening the chaos and ensuring that the incident lingers much longer than it needs to. Hopefully, Karen will come to realize that, in the end, sometimes the best way to move forward is to step back and leave certain things, like the hardworking K9 unit, out of the drama.